Hello, and welcome to the webinar on incorporating the infrastructure resilience guidelines into programs and projects for Hurricane Sandy rebuilding efforts. This webinar is sponsored by the President's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. My name is Micah Ragland, and I will be your host. Let's begin by introducing our panel. Joining me from the task force are Irene Chain-Semino and Josh Soslak of HUD, and Sarah Ellis-Peed from the Department of Homeland Security. Irene serves as lead counsel to the task force and the acting director for the New York State Office of the Task Force. Next, we have Sarah Ellis-Peed from the Office of Infrastructure Protection at DHS and the policy lead for the development of the guidelines. Finally, Josh Soslak serves as senior advisor to the task force and the lead for infrastructure policy. Welcome, panel, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Micah.
Thank you.
Let's get started by reviewing what we will cover today. Irene will give an overview of the task force and its purpose. Then Josh will talk about what we mean by resilience. Sarah will walk you through the 7 guidelines, and Josh will discuss specific recommendations of the task force as they related to the guidelines. Then the panel will discuss how to implement the guidelines in programs and agency and grantee projects. We will also discuss how the guidelines are related to other recommendations, such as regional coordination and federal review and permitting. Finally, we will discuss how to get additional technical assistance on these issues. Irene, let's start with you and a little history on the task force itself.
Thank you, Micah. In talking about the history of the task force, we have to start with the storm itself. On the evening of October 29, 2012, Hurricane Sandy moved toward landfall on the New Jersey coast. Although it technically lost hurricane status just prior to landfall, the storm was enormous, more than 1,000 miles across, with 80 miles per hour winds pushing water into the New York harbor at the maximum high tide. Sandy brought a record storm surge, 14 feet in some areas in lower Manhattan, resulting in the death of more than 159 people in the U.S., flooding neighborhoods, damaging or destroying 650,000 houses and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, and turning off the lights to 8 million customers up and down the East Coast. The federal response to the storm was immediate and massive. The president, working with the governors of the affected states, made it clear we would be prepared for the worst. More than 1,500 FEMA personnel were deployed prior to landfall and at the peak of the response following the storm. More than 17,000 federal responders and volunteers in the affected areas. Following past disasters, we knew that response was not enough. We needed to help communities rebuild and recover after major disasters, and in an effort led by HUD and DHS, created the National Disaster Recovery Framework, or NDRF as it is known. As a companion policy to the National Response Framework, which directs the immediate response activities, the NDRF is focused on the longer-term effort of recovery and rebuilding. Hurricane Sandy was the first major disaster where the full implementation of the NDRF would be tested across several states. The president also decided that in addition to the FEMA coordinated structure set up by the NDRF in the affected states, he wanted a cabinet-level task force to ensure that national policy issues were addressed. Red tape was cut, and the $60 billion in supplemental funding requested by the administration to rebuild New York, New Jersey, and the other impacted states was spent effectively and without unnecessary delay. So on December 7th, 2012, he signed an executive order establishing the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. The president named HUD Secretary Sean Donovan as chair, and along with former DHS Secretary Napolitano, the co-chair of the group that developed the NDRF, Secretary Donovan, who is a native New Yorker, was tasked to lead 23 other cabinet officials and heads of agencies or White House offices in a 6-month effort to engage the stakeholders, address issues, cut red tape, and prepare a Hurricane Sandy rebuilding strategy. That rebuilding strategy was presented on time to President Obama in August 2013 with 69 recommendations for rebuilding the region with an emphasis on resilience. Consistent with the executive order, the task force has completed its work and was concluded on September 30th, 2013.
Thanks, Irene. So following conclusion of the task force, each of the 69 recommendations was handed off to the agency or agencies that would implement that recommendation. One of those recommendations was the infrastructure resilience guidelines that Sarah will discuss. But before we do, I want to ask Josh to spend a few minutes explaining what we mean by resilience. Josh?
Thanks, Micah. For individuals and communities, resilience means the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and rapidly recover from disruptions. Disruptions may include deliberate attacks, accidents, potential threats, and naturally occurring incidents. Discussions of resilience will vary depending on three factors. The first is the focus of the effort and stakeholders involved. For example, resilience means something very different to the government of New York City than it does to you and your family. Second is the scale and time frame of planning and rebuilding efforts. What I mean by this is, if we're talking about just getting the water out of my basement, resilience may be making sure that there's nothing of value on the floor. But when we're talking about keeping the New York City subway dry and running, it's a much different discussion. The third factor is the expected return frequency and severity of the event. If you're planning a resilience for wildfires, for example, you probably need to be ready every year. But when you're planning for a massive hurricane with a 1% chance of happening, you make decisions differently. When we talk about reducing risk, it's important that we understand that we're not eliminating risk. We're essentially buying it down. Like all good concepts, it's best explained by a children's fable. So in this case, let's start with the Three Little Pigs, one of my favorites. As we probably remember, the Three Little Pigs, each of the Three Little Pigs had a house, and the big bad wolf came and threatened to blow their houses down. Was the wolf named Sandy? My mother never mentioned that one, but anyway. What we know that first pig's house was made of straw, and it came down with the first blow from the wolf. Clearly not very resilient. Now the second pig, he spent a little more, and he got for a house made of sticks. Clearly better than straw when the wolf comes a-calling, but alas, not strong enough. Down it came. Now pig number 3. He probably had a serious mortgage on his house made of bricks. And clearly, so the story goes, it was worth it, as the wolf, try as he might, was unable to blow down the house made of bricks. Okay, so we're clear on the concept. Stronger's better, and pigs need masonry homes. But here's where we depart from Mother Goose. Let's say, for example, that pig number 2 had done a little bit of research, and he realized that old Mr. Wolf was a 2-pack-a-day smoker, and his lung capacity was way lower than it had been in the old days. Now, in that case, his house made of sticks might just have been the best way to go. Sure, number 3's house was still stronger, but he was paying for something he didn't need. And since number 2 was now flush with cash, maybe he could just go to Florida when the wolf was around, and number 3 with his brick house was still safe, but he was house poor and never got to go on vacation. So the real lesson here is that we should use science and research to assess the risk and plan accordingly. But what we don't know is what the exact risks are. So in that case, we use data, we use the data we do have, and we make predictions. We might not know exactly what will happen or exactly when it will happen, but with some work, we can usually define the scope of the risks, the probability of those events happening, and the scale of the impact when they do occur. Let's look at climate change as an example. While we don't know exactly what all the effects of climate change will be, we do know that the sea level is rising. And we have some good models of what that will look like in, say, 2050 and at the turn of the century. We also know that with sea level rise, a smaller storm may have greater impact because the water level is already higher than it is today, and you have more storm surge. There will always be events that we haven't planned for, maybe we haven't even thought about, because they haven't happened in the past. We call those black swan events. But because we haven't predicted them doesn't mean we can't improve resilience. The best approach to resilience is a layered approach. No one barrier, safe room, or vaccine will protect us in all cases. So the best approach is to create a culture of resilience, one in which we all think about what will happen if reality turns out differently than we planned. Maybe that's why the motto of the Coast Guard is Semper Paratus, always ready.
Thanks, Josh. I don't think I will ever hear the story of the three little pigs again without thinking of resilience. Well, now we've talked about the task force and what we mean by resilience. So let's get into the meat of the guidelines. As I mentioned, Sarah Ellis-Peed is the Deputy Director of Strategy for the Office of Infrastructure Protection at the Department of Homeland Security. Now, while that's a long title, but she was also the policy lead for the development of the Infrastructure Resilience Guidelines as part of the Sandy Task Force. So that's why she is here with us today. Sarah, can you walk us through the guidelines themselves?
Sure. Thank you. As part of our mission to ensure the protection of the nation's infrastructure, the Office of Infrastructure Protection was very pleased to partner with the Sandy Task Force to develop these guidelines. But I should be clear that while we have helped manage the process, the guidelines themselves are a joint effort of the departments, agencies, and offices who are all members of the task force. These guidelines were a consensus product of the working group and are meant to help all agencies drive their efforts on resilience in the same direction. The reason we developed the guidelines in the first place was a realization by Josh and others that there was not a consistent definition of resilience across the government. While we understood that each agency, and in some cases programs within agencies, had different needs, technical requirements, and legal authorities, we also knew that with a program as broad in scope and impact as the Sandy recovery would have many of these programs and projects working together, or not, if we didn't help everyone foster a consistent vision of resilience. For example, we knew that wastewater treatment plants needed to be in low-lying areas because they are based on gravity flow of the sewage to the plant. So if we set a simple standard, like don't build any infrastructure in floodplains, we were going to have a lot of problems. So our standards, or rather, our guidelines, are more flexible. When the task force facilitated a government-wide standard for rebuilding that was a foot above the best available floodplain data, we also said you could meet the standard by moving the location, raising the facility out of the flood zone, or just protecting it from the impacts of anticipated flooding. Finally, we also reviewed the guidelines in light of the President's recently released Climate Action Plan. The Council on Environmental Quality, which led the development of the climate plan, was also a key partner in the development of the guidelines, so you will see a lot of similarities and consistency between the plan and the guidelines. So let's look at the actual guidelines. As you can see, the guidelines themselves are not complex. However, it's a lot easier to list the issues than to align all of the programs with them. I will briefly describe each of the guidelines, but I strongly recommend you review the text on pages 50 through 52 of the Sandy Rebuilding Strategy in order to better understand the specifics of each recommendation. The link to the strategy document is on your screen. The first guideline is comprehensive analysis. One key to comprehensive analysis is using the best available data and ensuring that, to the extent possible, you use predictive analysis, not just historical data. For example, the Army Corps of Engineers already accounts for sea level rise in their design for flood risk reduction structures, such as dunes and seawalls. In fact, the Corps, along with NOAA, USGS, and several other agencies, developed the sea level rise tool that is now available for planners and communities in New York and New Jersey in order to use this to assess the future impacts of climate change on the coast. However, when FEMA looks at the cost-benefit ratio of a planned mitigation project, it does not account for the increased probability of flooding due to sea level rise. It uses existing risks based on what the flood zones look like today and assumes probability based on what happened in the past. FEMA is in the process of reviewing its programs and regulations to address this issue, but you can see why it's important to have a consistent set of standards. Another core aspect of comprehensive analysis is to assess the broadest range of impacts. As you can see from the slide, we have given some examples of the types of data sets you may need to consider. However, with resilience, there is no one-size-fits-all, so you have to look at your program or project to know what is most applicable and relevant. Some key impacts to think about include environmental sustainability, changes to climate or development patterns, uncertainty, remember Josh's discussion of black swan events, and most importantly, public health and safety impacts. One of the most complicated issues to address are the cascading and interdependency impacts of one program or programs on other investments in the region. The second guideline is to have a transparent and inclusive decision-making process. This is less complicated to understand, but can be challenging to accomplish. The thing to keep in mind here is that there may be members of underrepresented and vulnerable communities who are significantly impacted by the way these actions are implemented. Ensuring that these communities have a voice in the process and that their issues are understood and addressed is an important goal. The third guideline is ensuring a regional approach to resilient infrastructure planning. This gets back to the cascading impacts and interdependencies I mentioned in the Comprehensive Analysis Guideline. For example, had Amtrak closed off the North River tunnels that connect Manhattan with New Jersey under the Hudson River during Hurricane Sandy, the floodwaters would have deluged Penn Station instead of the tunnels. Pumping the water out of the tunnels was a lot of work and delayed restoring intercity rail service, but had Penn Station flooded, the impact would have been many times worse. The fourth guideline is long-term efficacy and fiscal sustainability. Here, what we are driving toward is ensuring that the investments we make actually achieve resilience and that we have a plan in place to be able to maintain what we build. You can build the best and strongest defenses, but if you can't maintain and repair them, you may have wasted a lot of money with nothing to show when disaster strikes. Guideline 5 gets to the issue of environmental sustainability and innovation. Nature is a good teacher, and when you look at natural systems, we often find ways to use those systems or mimic them in ways that provide additional benefits as well. Wetland systems, for example, can significantly reduce wave energy during a storm, but they also have other benefits known as ecosystem services, such as improving water and air quality. The sixth guideline is to target and use financial incentives to drive resilience. Even with $50 billion in funding to support the Sandy recovery, there is not enough money to address all of the needs. We need to drive effectiveness, innovation, and creativity by rewarding it with investment. Competitive programs being launched by DOT and the Department of the Interior are some examples of how this can be done. Finally, the seventh guideline is to develop and attain resilience performance standards. Setting standards is an important way to drive not only federal investment toward resilience, but often these standards are adopted or even developed by the private sector as well. Examples in other areas include the Energy Star ratings, developed by EPA and DOE, and the LEED standards, developed by the U.S. Green Building Council. Efforts are underway to create similar programs for resilience by both government and private entities. As you can see, the guidelines are both broad and flexible. While many of these issues are probably already addressed in your programs and projects, the goal of the guidelines is to have a consistent framework for all programs and projects, and especially those projects that may include work under several programs. Again, I would recommend that people go back and read the section in the strategy on the guidelines, as well as the other infrastructure recommendations to get the whole picture. But we will also discuss some opportunities for additional technical assistance at the end of the webinar. Micah?
Thanks, Sarah, for that overview. The guidelines seem pretty simple until you start to look at how they interact with the programs and projects, but I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Before we get into that discussion, let's make sure we understand what we need to do. Josh, let me turn to you again and ask about the recommendations related to the guidelines. Earlier, when Irene was talking about the task force strategy report to the president, she mentioned there were 69 recommendations. Can you tell us about the ones that address the guidelines?
Sure, Micah. The good news is I don't have to talk about all 69 recommendations because only 2 of them are specifically about the guidelines. However, all 21 of the infrastructure recommendations are in some way related to the guidelines. But how about I cover the 2 primary ones now, and then we can discuss the relationship to the other ones a little bit later. Now, as you can see on the graphic, recommendations 4 and 5 are specifically about the guidelines. We'll spend most of our time talking about recommendation 4 to apply the guidelines to all Sandy federal infrastructure recovery investments and projects. Recommendation 5, like many of the things we found during Sandy, is a realization that there may be value in taking lessons from Sandy and applying them on a national scale. Sarah and her team will be looking at this issue through an interagency policy process, but first we need to focus on the Sandy recovery. So recommendation 4 suggests that we need to look at all of the federal investment in Sandy infrastructure and recovery and resilience through a lens of the guidelines. But remember, what we said earlier about each program having different technical needs and requirements, as well as different legal authorities. The guidelines recognize that the implementation of some programs may require a regulatory review or even congressional action related to statutory authority. So this might not be possible for Sandy. One goal of this process is to not delay the needed resilience efforts to achieve consistency. We won't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in our efforts to implement the guidelines.
Thanks, Josh. Well, so far we have covered the history of the task force, how we define resilience, the guidelines themselves, and the task force's recommendations. Now I would like to ask the three of you to help our audience understand how they can incorporate the guidelines into existing programs, new programs, and specific programs being undertaken by the agencies themselves, or in certain instances, the grantees. Sarah, do you want to start us off on this discussion?
Sure, I'll start us off. From my perspective, the most important thing for folks, programs, implementers, people at different levels of government to work on is to understand what their current projects and programs are already addressing. And then identifying which of the areas in the guidelines are there specific gaps that they may want to focus on. It can be as simple for some programs and projects as identifying areas of focus and then going out and looking at best practices in other programs and projects and taking it from there. I know, Josh, you have some specific examples of good projects and ways that these guidelines are being implemented already.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's interesting. When we look at this issue, one of the things that we realize is that you may have a program that's already set, and it may be difficult to change because you have rules or regulations around that program. And so what we're saying is you don't necessarily need to hold up anything. And in fact, we don't want you to hold up implementing your program. But what we want you to do is look at how you could incorporate it. So for example, HUD is looking at the second tranche of the CDBG DR funding to the grantees. And as part of that, they'll issue a notice in the Federal Register about how that funding is going to be used and structure the action plans that the grantees will come back with. And they will look at the guidelines in light of that Federal Register notice. DOT is developing a program for resilience. The Department of Interior is also working on that. So these are ones where you're actually developing a new program. It's a little easier to do it. For specific projects that grantees are doing, what we've recommended is that you ask the grantees to look at this, to look at what they're already doing. Because in many cases, they're already doing a lot of the stuff that we're asking them in the guidelines. For example, in New Jersey, they've looked at the guidelines, and as part of one of their programs, they basically incorporated it into their process. And in fact, they did it for a program that is set up statutorily so that we couldn't actually require them to do it. They did it voluntarily, so that's a really good thing. Irene, I know we've been talking with folks in New York as well about how to incorporate those guidelines, and they certainly see the value in these in the conversations we've had both with New York State and New York City.
Sure, and I think that it's a good point to say that what the guidelines are don't represent something that's new and controversial, that in many ways, folks that are trying to think about recovery have already started thinking about these guidelines. And I think the guidelines make it crystal clear, consistent with the applicable law, that these are principles that people should be thinking about along the way.
Yeah, I mean, transparency and inclusion should not be a shock to anyone. But what we're saying is look at that as part of this process and not as a separate thing. I mean, look at these things together. The forward-looking analysis is probably one of the most things that is different for a lot of people, really not looking back at historical data, but looking forward. And using targeted financial incentives, I think, is another one that some agencies are doing and some agencies have not done, but we've had some real good examples of that.
Yeah, I think this is a great benchmark for agencies to measure themselves against and programs to measure themselves against, to find ways where they can improve if they are doing really well in analysis, so they need to improve in incentives. They can do that and identify that as an area of focus for them.
One thing, I'll put a little plug in for the work that Sarah and some other folks are going to be working on, the recommendation 5, which is to look at the national implications of these standards. So as agencies implement these things for Hurricane Sandy, look at the issues that are related to your other programs and think about if you, for example, are looking at wildfire issues or seismic issues or drought issues, think about these guidelines and how they might be implemented on a national scale. And maybe they need to change, or maybe we need to do some other things. But there's going to be a policy process, and you can be part of that policy process to really look at that.
Definitely.
Great.
Well, thanks everyone for that wonderful analysis overview and what was a very informative discussion as well. I know when discussing these issues, they can come across as somewhat complicated, but I think you all have provided some concrete ways agencies and grantees can look at the guidelines and understand how to incorporate them in existing and new programs and projects for that matter. Josh, you mentioned that the guidelines had a relationship to other recommendations, specifically those in the infrastructure section of the strategy. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Michael, let me talk in broad strokes about how they relate, but then I'd like to ask Irene to talk about the specific relationship between the guidelines and the federal review and permitting process. If you've read the infrastructure section of the strategy, and I assume you all have, I know that what you'll have known is that nearly all of the recommendations, from the energy to transportation, green infrastructure to building codes, the guidelines are a common theme. Each of these recommendations touches all or some of the guidelines. So in green infrastructure, we talk about using forward-looking analysis, setting standards, using financial incentives, and of course, environmental sustainability. In the infrastructure finance section, the link to financial incentives is clear, but there's also a need to set standards and drive for a market-based solution. Probably nowhere is the need for consistent and coordinated standards more clear than in the federal review and permitting section. Now, we all know how complex and time-consuming the federal review and permitting process can be, but we also know how important it is to make sound decisions on the benefits and impacts of any large investment of this type. So let me turn it over to Irene to talk a little bit about the efforts we've done in speeding up the review process without sacrificing the important analysis and review that goes into these decisions. Irene?
As you mentioned, Josh, our goal in this effort is to reduce the time it takes to move a project through the federal permitting and review process without compromising any of the formal analysis and approval required. Our efforts are designed to consider and coordinate the work required under federal laws such as the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA as it's known, and the National Historic Preservation Act and their related regulations. We will do this in several ways. First, we will bring all of the necessary parties together to share information and work to understand the specifics of the projects and the reviews needed. This gathering, especially on the most complex projects, will allow us to anticipate and reduce redundant work by 2 or more agencies seeking the same data or analysis, but perhaps in a different form or from a different person, saving time and resources. Second, we will look for opportunities to share data and analysis across agencies so that one set of data can support several review processes. After Sandy, for example, Congress gave HUD the authority to adopt FEMA's environmental review when HUD funds are to be used on a project that FEMA has already cleared. Another tool is a programmatic agreement to adopt a consistent general approach to an issue or category of projects that can be negotiated before the disaster or afterwards so that work can proceed quickly during recovery. Finally, we have established a Sandy regional team of experts from all of the reviewing and permitting agencies so that we can coordinate these efforts and quickly address issues as they arise. This model has been effectively used during a pilot of nationally significant infrastructure projects, and several other regional teams have also been established in accordance with a recent presidential memorandum on the permitting process. The tieback to the guidelines is that many of the guideline issues are surfaced during the review and approval process, and by scoping and defining that process, we can ensure that we address such issues as comprehensive analysis, inclusion and transparency, fiscal and environmental sustainability, and regional coordination.
Thanks, Irene. Josh, before we wrap up, can you tell us about what additional resources folks have if they still have questions about the guidelines and how to implement them into their specific programs and projects?
I'll make this really simple, Micah. Here are email addresses, so please reach out to one of us if you have any questions, or if you'd like to discuss any of the material we've presented today. We're all available to help you understand these recommendations and guidelines, and through this interaction, we can share your ideas and concerns with others who may have similar issues.
Got it. Thank you, Josh. And that completes our program for today. On behalf of Secretary Sean Donovan and the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, I would like to thank you for joining us, and also to thank each of our panel members, Irene, Sarah, and Josh, for their insights and advice. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to one of them by email. Thank you.